Hey everyone, I'm Brendan Kelleher. In this video, I'm going to take an in-depth look back at Terminator 2 Judgment Day. There will be plot spoilers just so you know. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Released in 1991, Terminator 2 was once again directed and co-written by James Cameron. The story begins 10 years after the original film, where Sarah Connor has now had her son John. Sent to a mental institution for trying to blow up a CYBERDYNE factory, Sarah is estranged from John, who now lives with his foster parents. Meanwhile, a new advanced Terminator arrives from the future programmed to kill John. The human resistance send a reprogrammed Terminator back to protect their leader, as once again, the fate of the human race lies in the balance. With the runaway success of the original Terminator film, the careers of its director and star, James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger, took off. Their busy schedules meant that it would be several years before they would seriously consider doing a sequel. While Cameron had written the first film as a complete story with a definitive ending, Schwarzenegger always thought that the story could continue. However, the film rights to the Terminator partially belonged to Hemdale Film Corporation, which had been one of the financiers of the original film. A sequel could not be made without Hemdale's approval, as Cameron had surrendered 50% of his rights to the company to get the Terminator made. Also, Dana Ann Hurd, Cameron's ex-wife, was also a rights holder. In the intervening years, Cameron would concentrate on making the likes of Aliens and The Abyss, while Schwarzenegger would go on to make a succession of films like Predator, Commando, and Total Recall, and become one of the biggest stars in the world. By 1990, Hemdale would be in financial difficulties, and Schwarzenegger convinced Carolco Pictures, who he had made Total Recall with, to purchase film rights for $10 million. Dana Ann Hurd's share of the rights was bought for $5 million, and Cameron and Schwarzenegger had the green light to proceed with a sequel.
It took us all, I think, a while to realize that the Terminator had kind of permeated into the culture, and it just kept getting reflected back to me in so many ways.
You know, we should have an ongoing story because we're dealing here with such an interesting subject.
I knew, instinct told me that based on the strength of the first film, that there would be another one.
The catch was that Terminator 2 would have to come together fast, and a release date of May 1991 was set. This gave Cameron little less than a year to get the sequel made into theatres. Cameron wrote the script in 7 weeks with his frequent collaborator, William Wisher. Since the story involves Sarah Connor's son John being the target of Skynet, Cameron's original idea was to have Schwarzenegger play 2 Terminators, one good and one bad. However, Cameron gave up on this idea when he realised that in order to have the audience root for the good Terminator, the evil Terminator would have to be more powerful. Cameron toyed with the idea of an evil female Terminator, but quickly gave up on that as he thought that would be too comical, which explains why he had nothing to do with Terminator 3. Cameron went back to his original concept of the Terminator being an infiltration unit. Since 6-foot 250-pound Austrian bodybuilders tend not to get lost in the crowd, he wanted the new Terminator, the T-1000, to have an everyman look. In Cameron's view, if the T-800 model was a tank, the T-1000 was a Porsche. Unknown actor Robert Patrick was cast as the T-1000. This was one of the first castings of the film, given the complex VFX involved. For his character, he drew inspiration from Schwarzenegger's performance in The Terminator and observed hunting creatures, reptiles, insects, cats and sharks. Patrick's facial expressions were based on those of an eagle, keeping his head tilted down to imply constant forward movement. He also employed a mixture of military posture and martial arts to express a fluid motion that differed from the T-800's rigid movements. The role demanded Patrick be lean and fast, requiring peak physical shape. Linda Hamilton returned as Sarah Connor. Hamilton undertook extensive preparation for the role, working with a personal trainer for 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, and maintaining a strict low-fat diet, losing about 12 pounds of body weight. She also received judo and military training from former Israeli commando Uziel Gal. Newcomer Edward Furlong played the first, but certainly not the last John Connor to appear in the series. Furlong had no acting experience. Cameron described Furlong as having a surliness and intelligence, just a question of pulling it out. Furlong, among hundreds of other prospects, secured the role at his last audition. He was required to take acting lessons, learn Spanish, and be able to ride a motorcycle and repair guns. Terminator 2 became the first movie ever to have a budget of over $100 million, making it the most expensive film ever made at the time. A stark contrast to the $6.5 million the first film cost. The film would not only feature incredible stunt work and practical effects, but a breakthrough in computer effects imagery that Cameron first experimented with in his previous film, The Abyss. So the movie begins in a similar fashion to the original movie, giving you a brief recap of how the world ended and shows a future war against the machines. Setting the tone for the whole movie, everything is on a much larger scale. This is the only future war sequence of this film. Cameron throws everything but the kitchen sink into it. It's also the only time we see the T-800 endoskeletons in action. So that's what a phased plasma rifle in the 40-watt range looks like. As epic as this is, the future war scenes in the script were much longer, showing in detail what Kyle Reese alluded to in the original film: the defeat of Skynet, the discovery of the time travel machine, and John Connor sending Reese back in time. Despite the film's huge budget, this was cut for time and money, but also Cameron wisely made the decision that we didn't necessarily need to see this. However, these aforementioned story elements would eventually make their way into the later Terminator Genesis, nearly 25 years later. After the credits, we get the now traditional time travel arrival scene as a T-800 Terminator arrives through a time portal. Terminator enters a biker bar and acquires clothing in a non-lethal but still extremely violent scene. Incidentally, this particular location was very near where Rodney King was infamously beaten by the police, and only a week after filming was completed for this scene. Despite Schwarzenegger playing effectively a hero in this movie, Cameron conveys these early scenes to be very ambiguous as to the Terminator's true purpose. This was before the internet was a thing, and Cameron wanted to keep Arnold's true role in the film a secret for as long as possible. The early trailers for the movie even seemed to imply that the Terminator was once again the villain. Schwarzenegger was initially surprised in reading the script to see that he would effectively be the hero. Despite his highly successful action hero career during the 80s, Arnold's movies had high body counts, but Cameron was determined to convey that Arnold's Terminator would not kill anyone.
I swear I will not kill anyone.
Despite all the action, Cameron was determined to make, in his own words, a very violent movie about peace. He wanted to show that Terminators were like guns. They weren't necessarily evil, they just do what you point them at. Again, like the first movie, another visitor from the future arrives following the Terminator's arrival. The T-1000 at first appears to be a regular human being, but again, Cameron plays it very ambiguous as to its true purpose. He doesn't even show in graphic detail the cop it kills. From what we see, it could have easily been a punch to the chest, whereas we all know now, of course, that it was likely stabbed to death. This scene here as the T-1000 assumes the identity of a cop and appears to randomly touch objects is conveyed in more detail in the later deleted scene as it searches through John's foster home, as it's a way of gathering information. According to actor Robert Patrick on the audio commentary, they wanted to convey that anything the T-1000 samples on physical contact, it appears to be able to scan and learn more about, like it's reading Braille. We're then introduced to John Connor, played by Edward Furlong. And to be frank, at first he appears to be a childish little brat, and if he'd stayed like this for the whole movie, it would have been a disaster. If we didn't care about Connor, we wouldn't care about whether the T-1000 kills him or not. Thankfully, however, Connor gets more likeable as the movie goes on, and his initial snarkiness is somewhat understandable given what he's been through. Despite Furlong having no previous acting experience, he actually gives a really good natural performance. Incidentally, Connor's foster mother is played by Jeanette Goldstein, who appears in several other Cameron films such as Aliens and Titanic. Cameron's films often have supporting characters that are played by actors he's worked with before. Despite his reputation as a hard taskmaster, it just goes to show that he's loyal to his friends. We're then reintroduced to Sarah Connor, played again by Linda Hamilton. And at first it's hard to believe it's the same actress, as this is a complete transformation from the shy and almost helpless character from the first movie. Here she's been caged up in a mental institution, and she looks like a female Rambo, ripped and almost animalistic. This whole concept of Sarah being locked in a mental institution is actually taken from an unused draft of James Cameron's script for Rambo: First Blood Part 2. Cameron was hired to write the script for the Rambo sequel in the mid-80s, and his initial concept for that film, which at the time was titled Rambo 2: The Mission, had Rambo being locked up in a mental institution until being offered his freedom in exchange for rescuing POWs in Vietnam. Sylvester Stallone pretty much rewrote that entire script, changing the mental institution to a maximum security prison. Cameron shared final screenwriting credit on that film with Stallone, famously saying, "I wrote the action, Stallone wrote the politics." It's also here where we see Dr. Silverman, returning from the first film, being in charge of Sarah's rehabilitation. Like the first film, you get exposition and backstory explained in a very effective way, without it being boring or feeling like it's shoehorned in. For first-time viewers who haven't seen the first movie or have simply forgot, you get to hear Sarah's backstory, how she came to be imprisoned here, and about why the Terminator wants to kill her. While the characters don't believe any of this, we believe it. Anyway, Sarah's meeting with Dr. Silberman, where she acts like she's been rehabilitated, is one of the standout scenes of the film for me. Much like how Michael Biehn did all of the heavy lifting in the first film as far as acting was concerned, Hamilton is absolutely amazing in this film. We see her go through a wide range of emotions, where she goes nuts, wanting to act docile in front of Silberman, wanting for her to lash out in rage. It's an incredible performance from the actress. Meanwhile, the T-1000 calls to John's foster parents' home, and we see clearly that this particular Terminator is a much more effective infiltration unit than the T-800 model. It appears polite and easygoing in interacting with people, which actually makes it more scary. The only slight hint that it's more than it appears to be is when it realizes that it's not the only Terminator in town.
Yeah, big guy on a bike. Has that got something to do with this?
No.
One small detail that I only realized on my most recent rewatch is that you can hear dogs barking in the background. It's very faint in the sound mix, but it's there. It's a very subtle callback to the first film where it's established that dogs can spot Terminators. Tracking John Connor to the local Galleria, we lead up to the first major action sequence of the film, as much like the previous movie, the two Terminators attempt to find its target first. The fact that the Terminator is hiding its shotgun in a box of roses is a bit of an in-joke, considering that the tie-in music video for the film, You Could Be Mine, was performed by Guns N' Roses. There's a small bit here that always makes me laugh, and it's so brief, it's easy to miss it. But you can see one of the extras behind Arnold here giving a "Jesus, look at the size of this fella" reaction to his appearance. It just goes to show that there's no such thing as a small part in the movie. The T-1000 finally locates Connor first in an arcade, and John, thinking the Terminator is a cop trying to arrest him for stealing from an ATM earlier, makes a run for it. John quickly finds himself trapped between the T-1000 and the Terminator, and again, much like the first film, Cameron goes into slow motion just before the shooting starts. I think it's pretty cool and effective as Patrick manages to fire his gun, reload, and continue firing in fluid motion, almost entirely without blinking. He trained particularly hard for this and it paid off for him. Anyway, the Terminator carrying heavier firepower gets the upper hand temporarily, and we see the liquid metal effects for the first time. It's pretty clear that the T-1000 is an entirely different machine to the T-800, and doesn't appear to have any circuitry or any kind of mechanism. More on that later. As the two Terminators start fighting each other, John makes a run for it. The T-1000 throws Terminator through a window, and as it gets up, we get a cameo from the film's co-writer William Wisher. Wisher cameoed in the first film as a cop. I actually like to think that this is the same character that he played in the original movie. He somehow survived the attack by the previous Terminator, retired, and it's just fate that he ran into him again here. So John makes it to his bike, takes off, and is chased on foot by the T-1000. And if Robert Patrick really was a Terminator, then John Connor would be dead, as on the first take of this scene, he actually caught up to the bike. The guy could run. So the chase continues into the street as T-1000 takes over a semi-truck with the Terminator giving chase on his bike. What I like about this is John, and the audience, gets a brief respite as he thinks he's lost him in the canal. Cameron paces his action scenes very well. There's a tendency for chase scenes in modern movies to just go on and on without any rest. John's troubles aren't over though, as the T-1000 crashes into the canal and the chase continues. Even today, 30 years later, I'm still amazed by this chase, and it puts to shame a lot of the so-called blockbusters we get these days. The razor-sharp editing, terrific stunt work, and Brad Feidel's intense score all add to the excitement. Also, I just absolutely love how Arnold reloads his shotgun one-handed. It's one of the coolest things he's ever done. Although this took a lot of practice, and he nearly broke his hand doing it. Also, just to nitpick a little here, no shotgun shell seems to be ejected as far as I can see. They got it right in the Galleria though. Chase comes to an end as Terminator manages to retrieve John, and the T-1000 crashes his truck. It's here where we see the true form of the liquid metal T-1000. This is the kind of effect anyone can do in a mobile phone these days, but back in 1991, this was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. In the behind the scenes footage, it actually looks really dangerous for Robert Patrick as they shot live action footage for the shot. Despite the fire and intense heat, he still had to act like an invincible robot, and he really pulled it off. Anyway, Safe from the T-1000 for now, John manages to get the Terminator to fill him in on what's been going on, and finds out that his future self sent the Terminator back in time to protect him. It's here where we see John kind of talking to himself, as we hear a lot of his backstory and his life growing up with Sarah. I have to give credit for Edward Furlong in this scene. He appears very natural as far as acting goes, despite having no previous acting experience. It's also here where we get the not so subtle guns are bad message of the movie, as John realizes that the Terminator is programmed to follow his orders, which nearly backfires on him as a prank he plays on two fellows who think he's in trouble try to help him. John tells the Terminator that he can't kill people, which the Terminator doesn't seem to understand, as that's what he's built for.
You just can't go around killing people.
Why?
What do you mean why? 'Cause you can't.
Why?
Just to nitpick again here for a second, it's a little hard to believe that John's future self would send the Terminator back in time without programming it not to kill humans. It seems like a major oversight. I suppose you could say that future John is a much different person than his younger self, and more cold-blooded, but still. It's funny how Cameron said at the time that the movie has an anti-gun message, and even recently during his promotion of Avatar 2, that he said he wanted to reduce the amount of gunplay during the film. Because we all know that Cameron hates guns, right? With John being informed that the T-1000 most likely is going after his mother next, he decides to break her out of the mental institution. Meanwhile, Sarah, having been informed by the police that her son is in danger, and thinking that a new T-800 model Terminator is after him, attempts to break out by herself. Having swiped a paperclip, Sarah manages to free herself and rather violently knocks out the guard. While this guy had been portrayed as something of a pervert earlier, it at first seems Sarah may have been too brutal here, with a deleted subplot of her being abused by the guards would seem to justify her actions. Anyway, Sarah manages to knock out another guard and take Silverman hostage.
Broke my arm.
There are 215 bones in the human body. That's one.
Actually, there's only 206 bones in the human body, but never argue with a woman. They're always right. Meanwhile, the T-1000 arrives and disguises itself as one of the guards after oozing out of the floor. It's at this point I have to say that I've never really understood how the T-1000 works or how it's powered. I know this is science fiction, but the T-800 model is clearly a mechanism of some kind. I mean, if the T-1000 could become liquid, then I just can't understand how it can reform or be an artificial intelligence of any kind. Even the TX in Terminator 3, which did have shape-shifting abilities, clearly was a mechanism. It would be more accurate to describe the T-1000 as a creature of some kind rather than a machine. So Sarah manages to almost make her escape and runs right into the Terminator. Sarah, understandably thinking it's here to kill her, tries to escape and is caught by the security guards. John orders Terminator to help her, which it does so in non-lethal but extremely violent fashion. The only lame part about this is the way Terminator just shoves this lady to the ground and she just seems to fall asleep. I think she could have gotten up from that. As we say where I come from, that's a bit Irish now. John reunites with Sarah, who suddenly realizes that the Terminator is here to help in a nice callback to the original movie.
Come with me if you want to live.
All of a sudden, the T-1000 shows up and dissolves through some metal bars. Silverman's reaction here pretty much represents every audience member watching this for the first time back in 1991. Trust me, I was there. So another big chase begins as our heroes escape into an elevator with the T-1000 in pursuit, despite having its head blown open at one point. Again, despite this film's age, the effects here never cease to amaze me. Sarah and the Terminator attempt to ward off T-1000 with gunfire in the elevator. Again, just to nitpick here, I've always noticed that the handgun Sarah uses has a very weak sound effect. It's probably just for the safety of the actors, as surely the loud gunfire in such an enclosed space would be very damaging to the ears. Terminator's shotgun blast especially would be devastating to Sarah and John, so I'm guessing the sound effect was enhanced in post-production. Despite these safety measures, however, Hamilton has claimed she suffered permanent partial hearing damage filming the scene. The group make it out to the parking garage, where they hijack a car from a policeman. This poor fellow who ends up getting slammed into a pillar always makes me flinch. Despite supposedly being a hero character in this film, the Terminator is probably responsible for that poor fella eating of the straw for the rest of his life. After the group take off in the car, they manage to escape the T-1000. I've always thought that this bit here as John grabs a small piece of the T-1000 and gets rid of it was a setup for a twist that never came later. I mean, he touched the metal which was part of the T-1000, which can imitate anything it touches, right? Would it have turned into John? The group eventually finds a closed gas station to spend the night. Eagle-eyed James Cameron fans may notice that the symbol on the gas pumps is the same as the company Benthic Petroleum from Cameron's previous movie The Abyss. You could say that this is evidence that all James Cameron's movies take place in the same cinematic universe. Yes, even Titanic. It's at this point that the film switches gears a little and slows down to let us get to know the characters a little more. Sarah certainly doesn't entirely trust the Terminator yet, and we learn that it's capable of learning the more it interacts with humans. To save time, a very elaborate scene was deleted here, as Sarah and John try to reset the Terminator's CPU to write rather than read. There's no mirror as such used here. We used Linda Hamilton's twin sister for this shot, and it's pretty seamless. It's a scene that gets tense very quickly as Sarah almost destroys the switch to effectively kill the Terminator. I think Cameron made the right decision to cut all this, as it's strictly not necessary to the plot, and some of the dialogue is a bit cringy. Anyway, the group head off in their car the next morning, and it's here where we get vital backstory as Sarah gets the Terminator to give them details on how Skynet came to be and how it caused Judgment Day. On my recent rewatch, I find it incredible how this 30-plus-year-old film is so relevant today. At the time of recording this video, the subject of artificial intelligence is all over the news. Actors and writers are striking Hollywood partly over the use of AI in filmmaking. There are even AI programs that are used to write scripts and make videos for YouTube, for example. Not that I would ever do such a thing. Terminator is more than a film that has dated very well. It's more relevant than ever. It's not science fiction anymore. It's reality. Minus the killer cyborgs, of course. So the group make their way to the site of a gun runner who was an old friend of Sarah. It's here where we get some fun comedy with the Terminator, which is good without ever going too far into parody, and he even gets a nickname.
He's cool, Enrique. He's with me. He's, Uncle Bob.
You know what? I'm going to refer to him as Uncle Bob for the rest of this review. Comedy hijinks with John and Uncle Bob went a little too far in the original cut, particularly a deleted scene where Bob tries to smile. Unfortunately, the filmmakers behind Terminator Genesis seemed to like this and put it in that movie 26 years later. It wasn't funny then, and it's not funny now. The group stock up on weapons and ammunition. As Sarah works on her guns, she eventually falls asleep and has a nightmare about Judgment Day taking place. This sequence remains as frightening today as it was back then. Nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war seem to be a common theme in James Cameron's films. The blast scene has been unofficially described by members of the Federal Nuclear Testing Labs as one of the most accurate depictions of a nuclear blast ever put on screen. Sarah is so horrified by this that she decides to attempt to change history by assassinating Miles Dyson, the scientist most directly responsible for the creation of Skynet. The character of Miles Dyson, played by Joe Morton, can be seen as a Robert Oppenheimer type, who didn't realise the true danger of what he was creating. This scene where Sarah attempts to kill him is one of my favourites in the film. Linda Hamilton does such a fantastic job with her acting here, as she goes through a wide range of emotions. She goes from cold-blooded killer to extreme rage, sorrow, and almost catatonic in a very short space of time. Joe Morton does such a good job with the relatively short screen time he gets. His character is portrayed as quite sympathetic, if a bit naive. He doesn't blame anyone else besides himself when he's told what his creation will ultimately do to the world. And he doesn't hesitate when he's told that all his work on the project must be destroyed, no matter what the cost. So the gang heads to CYBERDYNE for a Mission Impossible style infiltration of the building. I'm not sure if this was a coincidence or if it was intentional, but the coat Sarah wears in this scene looks like the same one Kyle Reese was wearing in the first Terminator film. Knowing Cameron, it was very intentional. I've seen this movie so many times over the years, and I always spot little details I've never noticed before. Meanwhile, T-1000 reappears at the Dyson's now abandoned home. What's amazing and a true testament to how compelling the plot of this movie is that it hasn't been on screen for about 40 minutes or so. Schwarzenegger was a constant presence in the first movie, and was constantly on screen. At CYBERDYNE, the silent alarm is tripped, and the film goes into die-hard territory as a massive police force show up. John shows a lot of his burgeoning leadership skills as he hacks the security systems and basically leads Dyson around getting the chip and hand from the first Terminator. I love the little click sound Uncle Bob makes to Dyson after he hands over the detonator they intend to use to blow everything up. There are little details during the whole movie that shows it's becoming more human. This whole scene where Uncle Bob sends the entire police force scrambling with a minigun and grenade launcher without a single person getting killed just goes to show what a genius of action cinema James Cameron is. Even Schwarzenegger couldn't believe it at first when Cameron said that the Terminator wouldn't kill anyone in this film. Yet Cameron still comes up with exciting action sequences without going overboard on violence. I have to give a shout out to the sound design of this film as well. There's a tendency with big action movies to make gunfire as loud as possible, but the minigun here, for example, isn't as loud as you'd expect. It adds more realism in my opinion. Anyway, as the group gets ready to leave and blow the building, the SWAT team bursts in, Cameron again going to slow motion before the shooting starts. Dyson unfortunately meets his maker here, but manages to hold on long enough to detonate the bomb before succumbing to his wounds. I love the irony of Skynet's creator actually being the one to hit the button and maybe prevent its creation. So Uncle Bob, Sarah and John make it down to the lobby, only to have a SWAT team waiting for them. Uncle Bob marches out to neutralise them, and if you look very closely, you can catch what is a fairly large blooper, which I'm amazed that they didn't catch when editing this. As the cops open fire, you can see a crew member wander into shot. To be fair, I didn't catch this until one of my many rewatches years later. As the group make their escape, the T-1000 arrives and hijacks a chopper in such a spectacular fashion that would make Tom Cruise jealous. Another callback to the original film is T-1000 tells the pilot to get out. We then headed into the incredible helicopter chase as the group try to escape the T-1000. What I love about this is again, how everything's shot practically. The stunt driving and flying is so incredibly well shot and edited. There's also this insane bit where the helicopter just barely manages to avoid a bridge by pulling up at the last second. It seems like that was the shot where it was supposed to go under the bridge, but the pilot realised he wouldn't make it and pulled up just in time. They kept it in the film though because it looks so good. There's a shot which some people incorrectly think is a mistake, as we see the T-1000 reloading its gun while still keeping one hand on the stick. You can see 3 hands in this shot, but this is not a mistake. It's very brief, but the T-1000 simply grows another hand to keep piloting the chopper while using 2 hands to reload its gun. It's very brief but a very cool moment. The shot where it actually flies under the bridge, apparently most of the crew didn't want to have anything to do with it, but the pilot convinced Cameron that he could do it. Unfortunately, in recent years, Cameron has gone full George Lucas and tends to tinker with his films, and has actually said that if he was making this today, he would have used CGI for the chopper. That makes my heart sink a little when I hear that. The helicopter chase soon transfers to a tanker truck chase as the group switch vehicles. I just love how this entire climax just builds and builds. This whole sequence of the tanker truck kind of reminds me of Steven Spielberg's first film, Jewel, which was about an unseen driver in his truck trying to kill a man in his car for no apparent reason. Probably the most dangerous physical stunt in the movie is where the Terminator, played by Arnie's stunt double Peter Kent, transfers from its truck to the T-1000s to spray it full of bullets and turn over. So the chase ends with the tanker truck crashing into a steel mill. It's pretty clear at this point in the series that some kind of factory is the location for the final battle in these movies. T-1000 gets frozen by liquid nitrogen, giving Uncle Bob the chance to not only blow it apart, give out what would be the definitive action movie catchphrase of the 1990s.
Hasta la vista, baby.
This following sequence where the T-1000 slowly manages to reform is to this day absolutely spectacular. But it's also where it really stretches credibility that this thing could keep going. Like I said earlier, it doesn't seem to be a mechanism of any kind, and I can't see how it could possibly function this way. It's interesting though that this is the first point in the movie where the T-1000 seems to experience actual fear and genuinely shocked by what's happening to it. It's just as well that Skynet only managed to create one of these things though, because if it mass-produced these things, then the Resistance would have lost the war very quickly. Anyway, the group escape into the steel mill, while the T-1000 reforms and pursues, resulting in Uncle Bob fighting it one-on-one. It's interesting here is that there are signs that the T-1000 is beginning to malfunction, and that the ripple effect seen here is it trying to refresh, so to speak, in order to correct the problem. This is more explicit in the special edition, as its hand gets stuck on a rail and briefly takes on its colour. As Uncle Bob gets totally trashed by the T-1000, Sarah finds herself trapped. I can't help but feel though that as menacing as it is, striding towards her, that it would have had a better chance of succeeding in its mission if it simply ran. I know, I'm nitpicking. Sarah gets impaled on the arm by the T-1000, and I like how the film slows down for a few seconds, as we have the only exchange of dialogue between the two characters.
I know this hurts. Call John.
I think it's this scene more than any other that Robert Patrick manages to convey how even more intimidating T-1000 is compared to the Terminator in the original movie. As great as the special effects are, it's the intense stare and voice that he brings to the character that's most effective. Final confrontation occurs as John is fooled by T-1000's ability to mimic voices and is drawn into a trap until Sarah appears. Again, they made use of Linda Hamilton's twin sister for this shot and unloads her shotgun into T-1000, almost but not quite managing to knock it into a vat of molten steel. This particular shot here as T-1000 taunts her in an uncharacteristically human fashion shows that, like the Terminator, it's capable of becoming somewhat sentient, except in this case, it hasn't learned human compassion, but sadistic humour. Anyway, Uncle Bob appears and manages to use his last remaining grenade to blow T-1000 apart, causing it to fall into the molten steel, and is destroyed in quite spectacular fashion. I've always liked how in a panic, it changes into all the characters it's imitated throughout the movie, like it was experiencing real terror for its first and only time. So the movie comes to a close as Sarah and John get rid of all the components of the original Terminator by throwing them into the steel. However, the Terminator comes to the conclusion that it also has to be destroyed. This whole scene as John tries to convince Terminator not to go is just played incredibly well by both Furlong and Schwarzenegger. Furlong in particular gives a great performance here. It's just a shame that he burned out very quickly as far as his acting career went, and shall we say, went off the deep end in later years, resulting in him becoming too tired and emotional to play John in Terminator 3. So in an ironic twist in the conclusion of the first film, Sarah is the one who effectively destroys the Terminator by lowering it into the steel. It's incredible that a character from the first movie that scared so many people in 1984 would end up being someone everyone loved and cried for in the sequel. I've always liked how the movie's ending is ambiguous as to whether they managed to change the future or not. While other films followed, I consider them part of separate timelines, and it's reassuring to know that in James Cameron's universe, Sarah and John most likely lived happily ever after. Or maybe not. Overall, Terminator 2 is quite simply superb. Over 30 years after its original release, it remains one of the best sequels ever made, and one of the best action blockbusters of all time. It takes the themes and concepts of the original film and builds and expands upon them. More than simply being a repeat of the first movie, it takes the story in a new direction and has a lot to say about free will and the use of violence and whether it's justified. The film's action, stunt and special effects sequences remain timeless and put to shame modern day blockbusters. Performances are great across the board, but it's Linda Hamilton who is particularly outstanding, and she carries the film the same way Michael Biehn did in the original. For Schwarzenegger himself, this was the peak of his action movie career. While his character in the original was a mindless killing machine, he has an actual arc in this movie and successfully conveys that his Terminator grows as an individual. His whole relationship with John is the heart of the movie, and it would have been so easy for this part of the film to be mawkish and overly sentimental, but it works, particularly in the finale. On its release, Terminator 2 was a worldwide blockbuster. It was the highest grossing film of the year, making over $520 million, won 4 Oscars. While Cameron considered the film the end of the story and wrote the script accordingly, the rights to the franchise would be caught up in legal limbo for the next decade, and he would ultimately have no involvement in Terminator 3, which would not arrive in theatres until 12 years later, and that's the movie I'll be taking a look at next time. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more, then please give it a like. Consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. Share it with your friends, click the bell for notifications, and let me know in the comments, do you think they should have stopped at Terminator 2? Or are you glad that they kept making further sequels? Most importantly, I hope you all look after yourselves, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye for now.